Everybody, how you doing? This is Mark Ross with ITK Radio. Joining us today is Rob Atkinson. Rob is the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, one of the leaders in technology, science, AI, globalization, trade, all kinds of fun topics that we love here on ITK Radio. Rob, how you doing today?
I'm pretty good, Mark. How about you?
Doing great for a Monday, feeling good, ready for the week. Where are we finding you today?
I'm working at home in Bethesda, Maryland. Nice thing about COVID is it allowed us to really realize that a lot of people can work from home a lot of the time.
Well, let's jump into that. You've been at the forefront of technology, and also you have a huge background in urban planning, which I find really interesting. Love to chat with you about that and the combination of work from home, technology, all these great devices. Since we're in this new world, this new paradigm, is it as you envisioned? Are we using work from home to its full potential?
The funny thing is, when I was way back in the old days, from 1990 to 95, I was a project director at the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment. So this was an arm of Congress, advised Congress on technology. And they asked us to do a study on the effect of technology on the U.S. economy, and in particular on cities and metros. And we predicted that there would be this massive increase in telework, working from home, and that would lead to changes in where people live. A lot of people now actually I don't need to be in D.C. I can live out in the Eastern Shore, or I can live out in West Virginia, up in the hills, or whatever like that.
Right.
And we predicted that, and it didn't come true until COVID. Excuse me. And what that really shows me is how free markets are irrational, because we had all the technology, and the reason we didn't do it is the employer didn't want to go first, and the employee didn't want to go first, and we just had all these norms. Like you and I would probably have done this in person because of these norms. And COVID really broke those norms and said, hey, wait, there's a new way to do things. And now that's kind of an accepted way of doing work. And so I think it's still going to ripple through the sort of how we live for the next 10 years. People are going to be changing.
I'm really fascinated by your background in urban planning, regional city planning. I think it's very interesting for technologists to kind of come from a very physical environment. But I imagine you were thinking about tech, how it would be applied, and especially you were talking there about telework. Talk about, I'm very curious about city planning, where that goes from here. And you said the free markets are irrational. So at times it does take a major kind of, for lack of a better word, inflection point or some kind of upheaval. Why didn't you predict an upheaval? I mean, not that you could predict it, but why did you think it would take? Why did it take such an upheaval to kind of change the way we work and use technology? Is it more human behavior, or it's just the way the system is set up?
It's really much more, I think, about sort of cultural norms. So we all had this expectation that you had to have an in-person meeting. And so, if somebody's coming to town and they want to meet with me, and I said, oh, no, I'm working from home that day, I'll do you by video. They're like, what? Wait a minute, you can't do that. And so once we got to the place where we just said, hey, that's normal and that's accepted, it became we could do it. Now, the weird or strange thing about COVID is if it had happened 10 years prior, we would have had a very different and much more difficult response, because the technologies weren't good enough. We didn't really have cloud computing. We didn't have the video capabilities, the broadband capabilities. So it was a combination of, we put all these technologies together and they matured and everybody had them. And then we had this inflection point, and now it's now we can do this new way of working and living.
Yeah, the tech stack is really interesting. It reminds me of one of the failed internet startups I worked for back in 2007. And this is pre-iPhone. And essentially, we were trying to build a fancy digital wallet, your gift cards, loyalty programs, what credit cards you had, et cetera. And we didn't have a great smartphone. In fact, you had to load everything up web-based, and it was really clunky, and it took a long time. And you flash forward now, it's so simple and integrated to pay now with your phone, and the ability for tech to kind of catch up is equally important to kind of moving forward. So as you think about where cities are going and where workforces are going, is it a matter of humans wanting to be a part of that, or is it really having the technology in place?
Well, it's both. You have to have the technology in place to enable these kinds of choices to be made. Uh, 15 years ago, you had to be in Washington, D.C., you had to be in New York, you had to be in Boston. Today you don't. It's funny, I talked to a lot of C-suite folks, and I'm like, well, where's your headquarters? Well, headquarters is in, New York. Where are you? I'm in Columbus, Ohio. You just
Right.
hear that more and more and more, these sort of distributed teams, and not just management teams, but sales, marketing, and certainly tech and other things. So I was looking at, my son was living in Silicon Valley for a while. Actually, he's still there, but he's about to move to Boston. And his little teeny studio apartment, he pays more for that than I pay for my mortgage in Bethesda. So there's a lot of good reasons to leave the Bay Area, housing prices being so extreme. And so, and frankly, a lot of people don't want to live in a city. They would much rather live out in the exurbs so they can afford a nicer house with their family, or live out in the countryside. So I think we're going to move to a world where people's preferences for the kind of spatial or urban living environment they want will be able to be matched up more closely through their work than it was in the past, where you really didn't have a lot of choices.
Yeah, as someone who leads, one of the world's best think tanks, and you're obviously at the forefront of global technology, and your staff is thinking about, it's very global, very what's happening around the world. I mean, how are you thinking about it as a leader of your own organization? Are you taking steps to be at the forefront of, work from anywhere, or do you still have the office space? I mean, are you wrestling that with yourself, like how much time to spend in the office with the team, as opposed to also bringing in talent from around the world to join the
Well,
organization?
yeah, I remember about, ITIF is about 16, 17 years old. And one of my first hires, Daniel Castro, he came to me after about 2 years. And Daniel was and is great. He's vice president now, leads all of our internet policy work. And he said, "Hey, Rob, my wife is going down to Georgia to get her PhD, so I'm going to have to work remotely." And I was like, "What? What?" And so it actually worked out fine. But I don't know, 15 years ago, a startup company in Silicon Valley, they have a product called the Beam. It was a company called Suitable Technology. They donated one of these things, and it was actually a robot, kind of like a Zoom device on wheels. And so Daniel could drive that thing around the office, going into people's offices and having virtual meetings with them. So we've been doing that a long time. Our web development, our internet website person is in Denver. So yeah, we definitely have the ability to work remote. Now, one thing I did change about a month ago is I did make a requirement that everybody has to come in at least 2 days a week if you're in the Washington, D.C. area. Because I did notice that there's this nice balance between, if you don't work at all together, there's synergies, there's just teamwork, there's new ideas that bubble up if you're in physical proximity. So
Right.
that's our balance right now.
I think we're going to an age. I don't know. What do you think about this? Almost like we're in college, in the sense. I think about when I was in college. There was a campus. I'd show up when the classes were required, but the rest of it was really up to me. Like I could work wherever I wanted to. I could study wherever I wanted to, and it's almost taking back. I don't want to say agency, but there's a little bit more of like responsibility as the worker to say, yeah, I'm going to show up a few times a week. There's definitely benefits for that, but it's really up to me to be able to perform in different environments. How does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that. And I do think in a lot of ways, in some ways, it's harder for employees or people to deal with that, because in the pre-COVID days, if you just showed up 5 days a week and you left 10 minutes after your boss left, always remember that. I remember one time a person who.
Why do you say 10 minutes? You don't think it was 15 or 20 minutes? That's funny. 10 minutes.
Could have been 2. I remember this person actually ended up quitting, thankfully, because they weren't very good. Probably would have fired him. But I remember one night I would leave around 6 or so, and this person was always there. I thought, this person's working hard. And I remember one night I left, that I ride my bike. I had to go down to the garage. I came back. I forgot something. And as I was leaving, this person was leaving. And I'm like, you're leaving 2 minutes after I leave, just to show that you're working hard. And you can't do that anymore. If you want to show you're doing the job, you have to show it by results, not just seat time.
Right. That sounds like a Seinfeld episode in the making. Let me talk to you. I'm curious about like where my reading of this that cities are a bit behind on where we are, and even I think about homes, right? Like I can foresee homes in the next decade having a media, almost a personal studio where you can kind of do broadcasting and almost like akin to like having a washer or dryer room, right? I mean, stuff we kind of take for granted now, but a house will be much more integrated for technology and email broadcasting, and cities seem to be going to have to go that way too, whether that's better, infrastructure, travel, libraries that have more kind of podcasting space or broadcasting space. um, are cities seeing that? Are they ready for this, or are they way behind where they should be?
Well, I think it's a mix, just as it is with enterprises. You've got lead adopters and laggards. On the whole, U.S. cities, I think, are not in the lead globally. There are cities in Asia. There's cities like Singapore, for example, is probably pretty close to lead of being a digital leading city. They have a digital twin of the entire city, so they can model everything in the city through
Wow.
three-dimensional digital twin. U.S. cities are not all that good compared to some of the global leaders. Like I live in Montgomery County and for Maryland, and for a lot of years, Montgomery County always was ranked sort of the #1 government website. And I use the Montgomery County website pretty regularly, and it's pretty bad. It's just not that good. And you think of all the things that smart cities could do and enable, and they don't generally. So I do think cities have a long way to go. The other thing we could do, for example, is we should really radically change the building codes in the United States. And if it were up to me, I'd have sort of one uniform building code so that we could enable 3D printed houses much more easily. We have a big housing affordability problem, and we should be able to have, like in Austin, I believe they had a program where they 3D print really small houses for really low income people. What a wonderful idea. You don't need a lot of room. If you're a low income person, you don't have a lot of money. Why not allow houses to sort of fit those people's capabilities? Zoning and planning, they're still way too rigid. And so there's lots of innovations we could do.
No, I love that idea. About space. I mean, how much space do we really need, especially if you're in an urban core versus, as you talked about the exurbs. Let's step back and talk about industrial policy, where we are. I grew up in the industrial Midwest around Detroit and Toledo. So I grew up around a lot of people that are still in the automotive industry, but my whole family, both my grandparents, my father, my uncles, everybody was in the auto industry. And I've seen, the 80s and 90s where people were freaking out over Japanese cars and where we are today, and competition, globalization, all these things. But I think we're at a real big inflection point. Obviously, with China, we've never really had this kind of competitor here in the States with somebody so tenacious, but someone we're also so connected with and can learn from a lot. Where are we with industrial policy? Are we thinking about it correctly? Should we be afraid of it? Obviously it can be a bit of a boogeyman with certain political people. Industrial policy, where should we go?
Well, you mentioned the auto industry. I was in Ann Arbor recently visiting with my wife's relatives who are there, and my wife's cousin's husband, former Navy guy, worked in the auto industry. He was showing me around his shop, and he has I think a 1938 Studebaker he's redoing.
Yeah, he sounds like a Michigander. I love it.
Exactly, as well as I think a old Jeep truck, and like I was blown away. I mean, I know I'm okay working on cars and stuff like that. I can do it, but this guy was, he was, showing the body parts he was welding, and it's like that's incredibly valuable set of skills that we have in this country for people who can do that. And unfortunately, you mentioned autos. There's a report that we did looking at OECD data, where we looked at a number of advanced industries, including motor vehicles. And we said, hey, how much market share does each of these countries have relative to how big our economy is? And where has that been going? And if you look at autos, we have, you look at the Germans, for example, they have 3 times more auto production as a share of their economy than the world does.
Yeah.
China has twice as much auto production as the U.S. does. The U.S., to meet just the global average of automobile production as a share of our economy, we'd have to build about 14 or 15 new major giant assembly plants in the U.S. So we really have lost auto production, and it's potentially even more risky now as we shift over to EVs, where China's putting all of their resources into EVs. So look, the reality is we have to have an advanced industry strategy in the US if we're not going to lose, particularly to China, because they're putting billions, hundreds of billions of dollars into subsidizing their advanced industries. Now, if you're an American company, how do you compete against that?
Right.
How do you compete against a company that's willing to lose money for 15 years in a row?
Yeah.
You know,
So tell me, like, so what we're doing now, I mean, even like the Build Back Better, or what the Biden administration has done, or, Congress passing the Inflation Reduction Act and subsidies, and that's not really an industrial policy in the sense of like what, because I guess if we went to, both of us, if we went to Capitol Hill today and said, what are American priorities? We'd probably get 435 different answers, right? Every member of Congress would have their own idea. So, and even business probably doesn't have the right idea. They're very provincial or thinking about themselves. So when you say an industrial policy, it's almost like a Bill of Rights. Like, these are 10 things we believe, or 10 things we're going to focus on.
well, yeah, technically, what what an industrial policy is for competitiveness is to say there's a set of industries that are important to this country for a lot of different reasons. The high wages, what are called dual use industries that help both the commercial sector and the defense national security sector, and industries where we can compete globally. You want to focus on those industries. For example, we don't need an industrial policy for call centers.
Right.
I'm happy to have the call centers in India. What difference does it make? They're not
Right.
high value added jobs, easily replaceable. But imagine if we were to lose Boeing, a very important company to our country, high wage job, super good exports, lots of spillovers with defense. If we were to lose Boeing to either Airbus or the Chinese state-owned, massively subsidized jet company called Comac, we would never get it back again. It would be gone. So it would be like our machine tool industry that we used to have, or it'd be like our telecommunications equipment industry, Western Electric and Lucent, that we used to have. We're not getting those back. So we still have enough strength that we have to focus on that. But what we need is a national industrial strategy. And unfortunately, you mentioned the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. President Biden once said, if you want to understand my policy priorities, look at the budgets. And the Infrastructure Act was, okay, good act, although I think most of the money that's going to be spent is going to be actually repaving roads rather than expanding roads, which is what we really need.
Right.
But it's not industrial policy. The Inflation Reduction Act, it was principally an energy policy. It's a clean energy policy. But again, it's not really oriented towards these key industries. The only real measure that was the CHIPS Act, which was oriented to incentives to get companies to build fabs or semiconductor factories here, and also a tax incentive to do that. That was really important. That's going to make a big difference because we can't be dependent upon Taiwanese or Chinese semiconductors.
Has America ever, I mean, you're a historian as well as, an academic and think tank leader. Has America had in place an industrial policy before throughout our history? Or I would imagine when we first started as a country, it must have been much more unified in terms of what we're going to achieve. But is it just not in our DNA as Americans to have an industrial policy?
Well, the funny thing is, it's weird. We have this historical amnesia. I was asked by a journal, The American Conservative, to write a piece on this, which I did, and it's on their website, about what our tradition is. We've had an industrial policy since the formation of the country and the Constitution, with Alexander Hamilton, who was the Treasury Secretary under George Washington. And we had that industrial policy all the way up largely through the 1970s. And so here's what it was. Hamilton had, and there was another system called program called the American System, which was three things. It was tariffs, it was internal improvements, and it was infrastructure. So what the industrial policy of the U.S. was designed first and foremost to not allow us to be just an agricultural country that was selling, wheat and corn and wood to Europe and importing materials. And what's really interesting is there was this notion that Hamilton was on one side and Jefferson was on the other side. And Jefferson initially opposed Hamilton. He said, no way, we can be an agricultural economy. And what's interesting is nobody ever looks at what Jefferson did in 1816. After the War of 1812, Hamilton wrote a letter to his friend and he said, look, I was wrong. I thought we didn't need to have a national industry policy because I thought Britain was going to be our friend. But it's clear that Britain wasn't our friend, and therefore I've changed my mind. We have to have robust industry if this country can maintain its independence. So we've had industrial policy. We had tariffs. I was just reading something the other day about the first telegraph, which was Samuel Morse. The reason Samuel Morse was able to build the first telegraph, and the reason the U.S. took the lead in that, was because Congress allocated money to build a telegraph line from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. Without that money, Samuel Morse would have gone bankrupt. And that's just one of many, many examples where the government has helped. In early 1960s, the U.S. government spent more on research and development than every other country combined, business and government. So take every other country in the world, take all of their business R&D, take all of their government R&D, the U.S. government was spending more on R&D. That's a huge advantage we had. And now we're spending about a third of that as a share of GDP. So yeah, we need an industrial policy.
So who, as a citizen, like as a business person, as a citizen, as a voter, I mean, should I be communicating that to Capitol Hill? Should I be talking to my governor? Should I be talking to my business leaders? Should the CEO of Ford be spending time on Capitol Hill talking about the things he needs, he cares about, but also saying, hey, we need an industrial policy. Let's increase funding for X, Y, and Z. Is it really going to come from the voters to kind of change and create an industrial policy for the future?
Probably not. But you mentioned your governor. I think you said you live in Virginia. Well, your governor has an industrial policy. So did the Democratic governor. Now the governor is Republican, but the Democratic governor before that had industrial policy. I worked for a governor who was a Republican. He had an industrial policy. Virtually every state has an industrial policy because they realize very clearly that they're a little small fish in a big pond of global capital flows. And if they don't work to make their state attractive to export related industries, like they don't need an industrial policy for barbershops or McDonald's. They're going to get those because people live there.
Right.
But man, if we talked earlier about Michigan, if Michigan loses an auto plant, that's just not the auto plant they lose. It's all of those suppliers. It's all the workers who are no longer spending money at restaurants. So they all have one. I'm not worried about governors getting the message. I am worried about Congress getting the message. You mentioned, should Ford do that? The CEO of Ford. The CEO of Ford should do that. The problem with our CEOs is that, and it's not meant to be critical, is they're largely focused on two things today. They're focused on their short-term share price, and they're focused on their global capabilities, their global market share. So they're not going to be, for the most part, taking the lead in pushing the U.S. government to build an industrial policy for domestic capabilities. That's not their job, really. Now, what I would worry about is if they start opposing it, then I would be pretty irked. It's like you might not. I get if you're the CEO of Ford, you got other things to do, but definitely don't oppose this. Fundamentally, this has to come from Congress, and fundamentally, it has to come from the president.
It does seem we're in an interesting time. I mean, I think I spend a lot of time thinking about the world, obviously you do as well, just the nature of our work and kind of what we care about. And to me, I've been telling people the world has gotten really real in the last few years between Ukraine, understanding the Indo-Pacific, having a sense of, what Indonesia is doing versus Australia versus the EU. It's just much more complicated to me, but also exciting. But it can be intimidating. I mean, the world's a big place. There's a lot going on. So I'm always trying to think about ways to make this more accessible, globalization, instead of being so intimidating and, Ivy League or, in the ivory tower. I mean, how do you wrestle with that, making it accessible versus also saying, this is serious stuff Do you wrestle with that in your own communications or your messaging?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best messaging is when you can simplify something without making it stupid or too simple. Einstein once said, if you can't explain something essentially to your grandmother, you don't understand it. So I think the way to simplify it is to say, before 1990 and the breakup of the Soviet Union, we basically had a bifurcated global economy. We had two global economies. We had the first world, which was essentially the West, and the third world, the poor countries. And then we had the second world, which is the communist world. There's really very little trade between the communist world of China and Russia and the Soviet Union and the rest. It was sort of two completely separate spheres. Then we won the Cold War. The Soviet Union, what we thought we did, we won that Cold War. The Soviet Union disintegrated. And then we let Russia in the WTO, China's in the WTO. So now we lived in this almost like unreal world. The real world that we should have gotten thought was a bifurcated world. But now we're like for 20 or 30 years, we're in this world of, total global integration, total free trade. Finally, nirvana is here. In reality, that isn't what's going on. What the world we're living in now, and we're going to be living in for 30, 40 years, is essentially a new Cold War. It won't be the same level of bifurcation probably, unless China invades Taiwan, and then perhaps we'll go there. But it's definitely a Cold War where we're going to be, the West will be competing with China over global advantage. China has made it quite clear. Xi Jinping has made it quite clear. He wants China to dominate a whole set of advanced industries. Now, the problem is there's not enough space for everybody in this area. If China gains in single aisle planes, Boeing loses. If China gains in telecom equipment, we lose. If China gains in pharmaceuticals and biotechnology drugs, there's going to be less for us. So you just take that. If China gains in electric vehicles globally, there'll be less for us. So we're in a competition. We should just recognize that. And we have to win this. We cannot lose this competition, because losing the competition will turn us into essentially the UK. You don't want to live in the UK right now. I mean, it might be a nice place to live, but you don't want to live there from an economic perspective, because their industry has been decimated. They've got tourism, they've got what's called the City of London, in other words, banking and the like, and that's
Right.
about it.
No, yeah. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the UK. I've spent a lot of time there, and yeah, I don't know, very interesting time when it. I mean, they have the Premier League, which is great, but yeah, I don't know. They're in a very interesting situation. But let me, when you say us, I mean, obviously there's America, right, the United States, but then this idea of friend shoring, ally shoring, is it really like expanding operations or having networks in Canada, Mexico, Germany, or is it, hey, we got to really figure out what's happening here at home in the States? Or is it, yeah, let's find friends and allies around the world that are going to make this a super market, a super economy between the U.S. and kind of Europe, if you will?
It is the latter, absolutely. So I think Trump first of all, I think Biden made a fundamental mistake with regard to what's called the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He waited too long to get it passed. He didn't include provisions like currency manipulation. He had too many countries in it. And so then when Trump came in, who made a worse mistake of rejecting it, we could have and should have had a more robust Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, ultimately then allowing other countries like Britain and maybe Europe into it. So absolutely, we can't do this on our own. And I worry that many of the many of the Biden initiatives, like the Buy America provisions and the like, they're really alienating our allies. Now, the key question there, though, and I have a piece coming out in a couple of weeks in a European journal, is the difference between friends and acquaintances. So if we all have friends, which we treat differently than acquaintances.
Right.
Japan is a friend. Australia is a friend. Canada is a friend. It's not clear what France is right now. Macron was over there buddying up to to President Xi Jinping, saying, well, maybe he didn't want to be with America. Well, hey, Macron, if you don't want to be with America, why don't you guys fight the Ukraine war, in terms of weapons and the like? So I think we absolutely have to be working with our core allies and friends. It's not clear, frankly, whether France and Germany, what they want. What I think they want is they want their cake and eat it too. They want to sell lots of cars in China. They don't want to disrupt anything. And they don't want to pick sides. I think the world is one where you got to pick sides. And if you're not willing to pick our side, the side of freedom, the side of democracy, the side of openness, then you can't be our friend.
Yeah, I know. I think we're in the same agreement. I think just Macron, Germany, yeah, where are they? What do they want to do? I wrote a piece for The Hill a few months ago, just about when Schultz made his trip to China, and basically the headline was like, "There's no way Germany's going to decouple." He took 40, 50 executives with him from China, and like that's pretty telling where we are. Same with Macron. I think he had 40 executives with him on that trip as well. Listen, as we wrap up here, let me, as people think about this, especially from a communication standpoint, and there's such an intersection now. I mean, I think like a car, let's get back to the auto industry. I mean, to me, essentially a car now is like a smartphone. I mean, the amount of technology, it's funny you're talking about a Studebaker. I rented a car recently and there was so much tech in it. I literally was like, what is this thing? Like, how do I start this car? Like, what is going on? And just the intermeshing now, all these sectors now are, technology plus, whether it's healthcare, whether it's, equipment, transportation, even hospitality. I mean, there's so much going on and there's so much bleeding between kind of sectors. How do you stay on top of this? And how do you, as a communication pro or working with C-level executives, what's your advice to them just on how to feel comfortable in this environment or stay on top of it, frankly, about what's happening in the world?
So as I said before, I think the way to think about the world, the globalization, is that we're in a Cold War. It's not going to be the same as that, but that's a nice framework. It's a good explanatory framework for how do you think about and analyze things. I think domestically, the way to think about it is virtually every industry is becoming a tech industry. As you said, IT is being integrated into it. Retail is going to change, is going to change. Higher education, healthcare, you name it. So I think one way to think about that is to say, look, all industries now, or most industries are innovation industries. They have to deploy technology in new ways, or else they're going to be left behind. So that really puts a lot of pressure on companies because they have to think about not just adopting technology. One of the really interesting economic pieces of information that's been coming out over and over again in the last 5 years is how there's a small segment of companies in every market who figured out how to do this. And they're what are called the superstars. And it's not just Google or tech companies, it's every market, hospitality. Right. Yeah. And they're able to figure out this secret sauce of being able to apply IT effectively with new business models, and they're doing great. And there's a lot of firms who haven't figured that out yet. And so that's really the challenge, is how do we not, I mean, superstars are great, but I don't want to watch the NBA with just one superstar on a team. I want to watch it with a lot of really strong players. It's a much better game.
As we wrap up here, I'd be remiss to not ask you about AI. There seems to be a tremendous amount of hype, news stories every day. The cover story this week in The Economist had the angel and the devil, with AI, dual purpose, could go either way. There's also, Hollywood, the way we think about it or been entertained about sci-fi and, the evil doing of AI, and also, people losing their jobs, all this kind of stuff, but also thinking about how it's going to help people, become better performers, work more remotely, all this kind of fun stuff. Is it early days of AI, or are we further along than we think we are? Like, what should I be thinking about AI in general?
You should be thinking about, oh, thank God there's this cool technology that might come along and finally boost U.S. productivity growth. So the single most important thing for your kids, if you have kids, and for my kids, the single most important thing that's going to affect their lives, besides, a war or a new pandemic, the single most important thing is productivity going to grow significantly. So when I was a kid, productivity was growing 3% a year. So think about that. After a decade, everybody's about 42% wealthier every decade. Now it's about 1% a year. So if we can't boost productivity, particularly with all these aging people becoming baby boomers, particularly with this huge budget deficit, we're going to be screwed. People are going to be angry. They're going to be frustrated. We're not going to have enough money to go around. The reason I say all that is AI appears to be one of a few technologies that really gives us the opportunity to boost productivity. Yes, there will be some workers laid off, But, we did a study looking at the Bureau of Labor statistic data going back to 1870. We went through massive technological disruptions in earlier parts of our history. In the 1890s with farmers and tractors and things like that. And we survived and we did okay and we got a lot wealthier. The main thing I worry about now is this anti-AI bias. It's like Ludditism all over again. I mean, the idea that we should be afraid of this is just nonsensical. I mean, look, I can produce, I have a bunch of steel. Imagine we're producing steel and something, you know what? If we produce steel, we could make guns and we could go and kill everyone. Yeah, so we have guns, and yes, some people, bad people do bad things, but we don't kill everyone. We have rules. Most people don't use guns inappropriately.
Right.
Imagine we had cars. You could say, hey, you could drive down the street and kill people indiscriminately with your car. You could, but you don't. AI will be absolutely no different. So we should stop worrying, we should stop rejecting it, and we should embrace it. That's not to say that there aren't going to be, like, for example, if you want to put AI in a car, yeah, you're going to be regulated because anything you put in a car is regulated because we regulate cars, which we should. If you want to put AI in a medical device, you will be regulated, as you should. But most things in AI, like, AI on your spreadsheet or your accounting system or AI in your hiring or like that, those are all going to be AI in producing news articles. Those are all going to be for the good.
Well, I love it. I'm feeling better already. As we wrap up, Robert, I appreciate you taking the time. This was a lot of fun. I enjoyed chatting with you. I wish we had more time. I mean, especially your work. I'm keen about your work in the UK with the G7, other smart industrial people around the world. But as we wrap up, anything you're reading or watching fun that we should have on our nightstand?
Well, I have to say the fun thing I'm watching is with my family is this great Netflix thing from Korea called the Extraordinary Attorney Woo. I don't know if you ever.
Oh yeah, I've seen a few episodes. Yeah, it's great.
Great. I love Korean. Korea, like the Squid Game was fantastic. Korean, man, amazing how they went from a sort of copier country now to really creative in so many different areas. So I'm watching that for fun. In terms of what I'm reading a book. Fascinating book called Mao's China and the Cold War by Chen Jian. And I'm also reading a cool book by Gordon Correa called The Russians Among Us. It's a story about sleeper cells in the US, including from Putin. So really, really fascinating book.
That sounds, I love The Americans, the TV show. So that sounds like something I definitely want to read. And as two people who live in the DC area, I assume at least a third of the people I meet are some kind of foreign operative. So that makes it fun.
When I go walking with my daughter, near us, there's a little creek and everything like that. And there's a little bridge, and that's the bridge where pretty sure it was Aldrich Ames or Hansen. I can't remember. That was their dead drop for the KGB. Wow. And it was like, hey, right there was a spy dead drop. We walked by. It's pretty cool.
That's pretty cool. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, Robert, thanks for taking the time to chat with us. If people want to follow up with you, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
R. Atkinson at ITIF.org, and our website obviously is just ITIF.org.
Perfect. I love it. Well, thank you so much. It was great to chat with you. Have a good day.
Mark. Thank you. You too. Bye.